the meeting for Saturday? Put it in the description, maybe.
Beautiful. Beautiful. All right, Shabbos, say good morning, a good Chodesh, a great Sukkot Baruch Hashem, to begin the week together, to begin the month together. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's share. To thank our annual Talmud Torah sponsor, Tilsim Shmach Havar Yisrael, for dedicating all the Shuman Drushos this year as a zechus for Besoros Tovos for Am Yisrael. Our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Elul, Haba'alim L'Tova, Bennett Goldberg, for an aliyah from the Neshama of his father, Avram ben Asher Pinchas, his mother, Feger Rezel Bas Zelig, and in the hopes that the tefillos of all those who Bennett knows and doesn't know in our Beis HaKnesses, in our SOTC family, will the Meretz Hashem be answered during this holy month. Incredible. Talmud Torah sponsor Shmuel and Liwa Dinovitz, Le'ilui Nishmas, David Flum's father, Rabbi Ari Flum, Yitzchak Aryeh ben Hachavar Rabbi Yaakov, Zichron Livracha, and our Day of Learning sponsor, Stan and Cynthia Ringo, in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Cynthia's mother, Miriam Bas Yaakov, Zichron Livracha. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the Neshama Slav and Aliyah, the families in Nechama, all those who need to refuah should everyone together with Kol Cholei Yisrael. Kadosh Baruch Hu Shlei Meretz Hashem, bring home our hostages, B'Shalom and B'Karov. Allow our holy soldiers to be successful, B'Chol Maaseh Yedayim, and truly give all of Klal Yisrael a ksiva, the Chasima Tova. Both say with that, let us begin. Today's daf is Samiches 68, and we are picking up in Meretz Hashem on a Samiches, 3 lines down from the bottom, 3 lines down from the top. So Amru Ula. So say, remember again, at the end of yesterday's daf, we really came into a fascinating machlokes, which is we were operating the entire daf yesterday under the assumption, or with the understanding, that what we call nosein tam lifgam is mutter, that if you have a mixture and there is a flavor infusion, and the flavor infusion has a detrimental effect on the general mixture, that halacha l'maaseh, that is mutter. That is mutter. That's what we were operating the entire time. The Gemara surprised us. You would think something thousands of years would not contain too many surprises, but alas, it did. And it surprised us, actually shocked us, by introducing us to the position of Rabbi Meir. And Rabbi Meir is of the opinion that halacha l'maaseh, even nosein tam lifgam is going to be aser. It's going to be aser. So now we're going to analyze that machlokes a bit more. Amr Ula. Ula says as follows: Machlokes shishbiach ulbasof pagam. Ava paga beinkara divra komoter. So Ula qualifies this, kind of softens this machlokes a little bit. Ula says, one second. When is there machlokes Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Shimon? Only when first the flavor infusion was beneficial, and then it subsequently became detrimental, right? What's a good example of that? We had this yesterday. A good example of that: vinegar in cold beans, in cold split lentils, in cold greasing that was subsequently heated up, right? Because again, everyone knows vinegar on cold greasing is great. Vinegar on hot greasing is terrible. So if you have ultimately again vinegar introduced to cold greasing, that's nosein tam l'shvach. And then you heat it up, that then becomes lifgam. That then becomes detrimental. So Ula wants to suggest that's the machlokes. That's the machlokes case between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Shimon. When it begins l'shvach, it begins beneficial and then turns detrimental. But if it is detrimental from the beginning, everyone agrees mutter. So Gemara says, "Eisera chaga leula." So Rav Chaga raised the kasha to Ula. Yayin shenafal l'soch adoshim, the chomet shenafal l'soch grisen. If you have wine that fell into lentils, or chomet's vinegar that fell into grisen, aser. Ultimately, again, it is aser. For Rabbi Shimon matir, and Rabbi Shimon says that it's mutter. And I will say that's very interesting. For whatever the reason, Rav Chaga is assuming over here that the case is where the vinegar fell into cold greasing, the vinegar fell into hot greasing, and therefore this is nosein tam lifgam. And yet, Rabbi Meir still holds that halacha l'maaseh it's aser. V'hahacha de paga meikarahu upligi. And yet here again, it's what we call paga meikara. Ultimately, again, it's detrimental from the beginning. How is it detrimental from the beginning? Because halacha l'maaseh again, we are making the assumption that the greasing were hot, and yet Rabbi Meir is still saying that it is aser. So Amar Ula responded to this, and not very kindly. He says, Chaga lo meida yada maika amri rabbanon tiyufta kamosiv. Chaga doesn't know what the rabbis are saying. and he is raising a contradiction, which is another. So Ula, I'll say it's interesting, right, in the Gemara, how sometimes you feel, and sometimes there are certain great people that feel that certain questions that are asked are beneath the, what we'll call like the intellectual integrity of the asker, right? In other words, as much as we like to say in the process of learning that there are no bad questions, right? There are no foolish questions. Apparently there are, right? Apparently there are. Now again, for people like us, like we'll call it, like we're starting out. So okay, for us, every question is good because it represents the desire to understand more. But in the Gemara, Rav Chaga comes along and Ula says, Rav Chaga, like you should know better. You should know better, and you should be a bit more worked out and a bit more thought out before you go ahead and you ask questions. How come I asking on? Because Ula said, no. What's the case over here? No, the case of that brisa is a case of where the vinegar fell into cold greasing and was then heated up. Oh, what is that a case? That's a case ultimately again of no same time l'shvach, positive taste infusion that then becomes negative. Okay, and therefore again, Ula says this exactly supports my idea because actually the Brisa is Dafka talking about a case of vinegar that falls into cold greasing and was then reheated. That is exactly the case we're talking about over here. Exactly a case ultimately again that begins l'shvach, positive, and then turns out l'fgam. Rabbi Yochanan, so we'll say, so this is the position of Ula. Ula holds that, see, Ula kind of takes us back to what we originally thought. Ula says everyone agrees no sin tam lifgam is mutter, right? That when there is a negative, we'll call detrimental taste infusion, the result is going to be mutter. Everyone agrees on that. What's the machlokas? The machlokas is something is no sin tam lishvach and then turns lifgam. That's the machlokas. That's the machlokas. Okay. Rabbi Yochanan says no, not true. Rabbi Yochanan Amar b'pikam meikara machlokas. Not true. We go back to what we kind of go back to what we thought yesterday. The Gemara suggested yesterday that the actual machlokas is even when it's no same time lifgam from the beginning. From the beginning, that if you have a mixture and the taste infusion is objectively detrimental from the beginning, even still, that's the machlokes. Rabbi Meir will still say that it's asur. Rabbi Shmuel will say that it's mutar. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yochanan Amar, v'gam mikar machlokes. Ibaylo, fine. So I'll say, that's Rabbi Yochanan. So again, we have a fundamental machlokes between Ula and Rabbi Yochanan as to what is the machlokes Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Shimon. Ibaylo, Smaras Akasha, bepoge meikara machlokes. Aval hishpiach l'basof pagam divrei hakol asur. So here's the shayla in Rabbi Yochanan's version. So are we saying that when it's no same tam lifgam from the beginning, that's the machlokas? But what happens again if it was no same tam l'shvach, beneficial taste infusion, and then turns negative? Again, easy case to remember like that is what? Vinegar, cold greasing, and was then heated up. So does everyone agree that that's asur? Odilma, bein bezu machlokes. Or maybe it's a machlokes in both cases. In other words, maybe it's a machlokes by no same tam lifgam, where the initial flavor infusion is detrimental. And it's also machlokes when the flavor infusion is beneficial and then turns detrimental. Which one is it? Which the Gemara says, Teku. We're not sure. Okay? So Amrav Amram. See, here's the issue. Rav Amram was bothered by this. Rabbi Yochanan, if you're right, and if indeed there really is a machlokes tanam over between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Shimon, and Rabbi Meir really holds that no sin tam lifgam is asur, right? That really Rabbi Meir holds that if you have a mixture and the taste infusion is detrimental, Rabbi Meir still holds in that case it is asur. And Rabbi Shimon says in that case it's mutter. Shouldn't you find that? Shouldn't that be somewhere in a Mishnah? Now, what does that mean? It's another way of saying is there are some things on both sides that are so dramatic and so major and so important that they should show up somewhere within a Mishnah. So the Gemara says, or at least the Brisa. So the Gemara says, Nafak, dak, va'ashkach. So Rav Amram went out, he searched, and he found. They both say, what a phrase. What a phrase. That by the way, that's not just right, that's a mantra. That's a mantra. Nafak, he went out. Dak, he exerted himself. Ashkach, he found. You know, the Gemara Maseches Megillah says, Im yomer lecha adam, if a person will tell you, Yagati v'lo matzasi, I searched, I tried, but I didn't find, al ta'amin, don't believe him. Why? Because if he really searched, he would have found. Really search in life, if you're willing to put in the effort, you will see the results. Now, maybe not all of the desired results, maybe not the results ultimately again that you had intended, but there is no such thing in life as putting in effort and not achieving something. So this is a tremendous, tremendous yisod that Rav Amram is teaching us. First of all, I'll say what Rav Amram is teaching us is, if you notice, by the way, what does Rav Amram do? He poses the kasha, and then what does he do? He searches for the answer. All too often, we pose problems and we expect other people to solve them. If you have a problem in life, okay, so obviously there are times I can't solve my own problems. That's when I absolutely have to reach out to other people. But there are a lot of times in life when I can solve my own problems. So instead of just voicing the problems and then waiting for someone else to deliver the solution, whatever the problem is, go figure it out. Go out. Nafak, dak, ashkach. Lesson 1. Lesson 2, if you're willing to put in the effort, you will see results. But again, nafak, you have to be willing to move yourself. Duck, you have to be willing to put in effort. And if you're willing to move yourself, sometimes out of a state of life paralysis, you're willing to put in the effort, ashkach, you will find results in life. What, but I will say, it's only the first day of Elul. And look, it's like literally, even if Rosh Hashanah was tomorrow, we'd be prepared. We'd be right, that's all. A little bumpers. Somebody needs to start creating Daf Yomi merch. Why do we have no Daf Yomi merch? Zero. How is this not like, I don't know, like a bumper? Nafak, dak, ashkach. That's it. It's a mantra. Nafak, dak, ashkach. Okay, fine. The Gemara says, so he went down and he found it. Tisanya, Sa'ar shel chulin, shenafal socha isa. So what happened over here? This is a very interesting case. So you have now Sa'ar, remember again, Sa'ar means like yeast. Like he's a leavening agent. So you have a leavening agent of chulin that ultimately again falls into a dough. And indeed, what happens? That leavening agent is strong enough to go ahead and make the loaf into a loaf of bread, to leaven the bread. And indeed, it does so. Okay, watch this. Now, what happened over here? Then afterwards, what occurs? More yeast falls in. But in this case, what kind of yeast? Aser yeast. Yeast ultimately, again, of truma, yeast of klaya kerem, ultimately falls in. Now, interestingly enough, that yeast also has enough to make the bread chametz. So we'll say, so now, what's the status of the loaf? So the Gemara says, Rabbi Shimon Matir. Rabbi Shimon says, ultimately, again, it's mutter. Now we'll say, now, why is it mutter? This is fascinating. Why is it mutter? Rabbi Shimon holds, no saint tam lifgam. Why? Because by the time that, let's say, the truma yeast fell into the loaf, what was the status of the loaf? It was good to go. We'll say, what happens when you put in too much yeast into a loaf of bread? It spoils it, right? It's not good. It becomes inedible. So ultimately, again, Rabbi Shimon says, in this case, when the yeast ultimately of truma falls into the loaf was already leavened. It was already good to go. Therefore, the additional yeast actually is detrimental. That is called nosing tam lifgam. And therefore, again, the loaf ultimately, again, is mutter. Rashi says, Rabbi Shimon Matir, shechmitza yoser midai v'nifkama. Ultimately, again, it's too leavened, and therefore, ultimately, again, it's pagam, no savgam, therefore it's mutter. Mara says, the pagam me'ikarahu upligi. Now, if you notice over here, this is a perfect example. This is a case of where it's paga me'ikara. Now, what does that mean? It's in other words, it's detrimental from the beginning. In other words, the moment that the truma yeast falls in, already it's no good. So here, boss, remember again, let's go back for a second. What are we looking for over here? Rav Amram came along and said, wow, this machlokes Rabbi Shimon Rabbi Meir is such a major machlokes about no saint tam lifgam. Rabbi Meir says, aser, Rabbi Shimon says, mutter. It's such a earth-shattering machlokes, it should live somewhere in Mishnaic or Brisa literature. Rav Rambam says, I got to find something. He finds it. Here it is. A loaf of bread, you're making bread, regular yeast is put in, bread is good to go, then yeast of truma falls in. Rabbi Shimon says, mutter. Why? no sing tam lifkam is mutter. Here it is. See, here is a Mishnaic allusion to this machlok. Not allusion, Mishnaic statement. So the Gemara says, incredible. So we'll say, so again, first opinion said aser, and Rabbi Shimon said mutter. So this is mamish the machlokes, Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Shimon. Incredible. So the Gemara said, Rabbi Zara, no. Shiny Isa, this is not necessarily a good case, and I'll tell you why. A dough may be different. Why? See, Rabbi, here's what's interesting. As much as this dough may now be currently inedible, right? You can't eat it, but it is not really a typical case of pagam. Why? Because it is usable. What is it usable for? Essentially, it's like a starter, right? Essentially now, it's over-leavened, but because it's over-leavened, it can be used for other loaves. So as much as it's lost its edibility, at the end of the day, it has not lost its usability. Rashi says over now, Rashi just pointed out over here, of course, it can be used as a starter for other loaves. Only what kind of loaves? Truma loaves, right? Because remember, you do have leaven of truma that has now been mixed in. So it's limited usage, but usage nevertheless. So therefore, we'll say the Gemara just says, the Gemara says this might not be the best case because this is not a typical case of no sein tam lefkam. No sein tam lefkam usually means it's really unusable. Here, it's not unusable. It's inedible, but certainly usable. Which will say also another profound yesod in life, that sometimes just because something is not usable for one thing doesn't mean that it doesn't have a different purpose. We encounter this all the time in life, where I view myself as a person who does certain things, and now, for whatever the reason, those doors are closed to me. Sometimes it happens because of age. As we get older, we cannot do the things that we did when we were younger. And sometimes it's frustrating and it's upsetting and it's disillusioning. Or sometimes it's not just in the realm of physical abilities. It's just life has a way of just kind of shifting on us, and things that I wanted to do, I can no longer do. We always speak about this. Life is about the power of the pivot. It's all about the pivot. And even if you can't do the same things when you're older that you did younger, or even if certain doors have closed, so things that I wanted to do are now not accessible to me, life is about finding maximum meaning in the circumstances you have in front of you. So this loaf of bread is no longer edible. But just because you're not edible doesn't mean you're not usable. Usability is always there. It's just a function of figuring out the best way to maximize the current set of opportunities. Tremendous. So the Gemara goes weiter. Tashma, Zara shel truma, Zara shel truma shel chulin shnaflu socha isa. So here we go, I'm quoting this again. So you have now, in this case, where in the previous case, the leavening agents, right, the leaven, we'll call it the yeast, right, the leaven fell in successively, right? First you had Zara shel chulin, making the bread edible, and then afterwards Zara shel truma rendered the bread inedible. This case is a little bit different. So Tashma, Zara shel truma v'shel chulin shenaflu socha isa. So I'll say in this case over here, they are falling in together, right? So you have again the leavening agent of truma and of chulin that both fall into the dough together. So first white line above, say on the bottom, bazeketei l'hachmitz ubazeketei l'hachmitz. Both of them are powerful enough to make the loaf chametz. So what's the halacha? So the Gemara says, bazeketei l'hachmitz aser. So ultimately, again, Tanakama, who we're identifying really as Rabbi Meir, says that it is aser. Ultimately, again, it's going to be aser. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Shimon mater. Rabbi Shimon ultimately says that it is mutter. Now, what's Rabbi Shimon's logic? Rabbi Shimon will say this is no sein tam lefkam. No sein tam lefkam. Ultimately, again, obviously, whatever order it is, clearly when you put two leavening agents into a loaf, the loaf is no longer edible. Therefore, this is no sein tam lefkam. Nafal, a couple of more variations of this case. Nafal shal truma techila divrei kol aser. If the truma one falls in first, everyone agrees the loaf is aser, which makes sense because then it was the truma leavening agent that had the ability to go ahead and make the loaf into bread. Nafal shal chulin v'achar kach shal truma aser. We'll say this seems to go back to our previous case. What happens if the chulin one fell in first and the truma one fell in second? O klaya kerem. Now, by the way, it doesn't really matter what the second leavening agent is. In other words, whether it's truma, klaya kerem, doesn't really make a difference, right? What matters over here? What matters? It's aser. it's aser. There's two, it's aser. And the second one ultimately, again, is having a negative impact on the loaf. So what's the halacha? Aser. Aser for Rabbi Shimon Matir. And Rabbi Shimon says that it's mutter. So we'll say now, especially in this last case, v'hahacha depaga meikaro pligi. Now again, we'll say, here it is. Here it is. This is no sein tam lifgam. Right? The first leavening agent falls in, which was chulin. The loaf is good to go. Then the second one falls in, and it was truma, or it was kloya kerem. Again, now the loaf is over leavened, no longer edible. And yet, Rabbi Shimon says that it's mutter. Rabbi Shimon says that it's mutter. Now, this is a case of no sein tam lifgam. And yet, Rabbi Shimon says that it's mutter. Right? Good. You have Rabbi Shimon saying that it's mutter, and obviously, again, Rabbi Meir is saying that it's aser. So the Gemara says, upligi, and they're arguing. So again, the Gemara is just saying, you seem to have over here a raya. This is a proof from a brayso that there really is a machlokes about no sein tam lifgam, whether or not, again, it is mutter or aser. Maybe you'll say, hachanami, Rabbi say, amud beis, hachanami kid Rabbi Zara. Well, one second. Maybe we can go back to Rabbi Zara, that this is not a typical case of no sein tam lifgam. What did Rabbi Zara say? Rabbi Zara said that in these cases, even though the loaf is inedible, right, but what? It's still usable. It's still usable. What is it usable for? As a starter for other loaves. So maybe this is just not a typical case of no sein tam lifgam, to which the Gemara says, Tashma miseifa. Look at the end of the brayso. Here we go. Hayayin shenafla l'soch hadashim, v'chometz shenafla l'soch grisin aser. So look at the end of the brayso. Always the end of the brayso. Wine falls into adashim, lentils. Or chometz, vinegar, falls into grisin. We cannot get away from this case. Right? Chometz falls into grisin, aser. Ultimately, again, it is aser. Rabbi Shimon matter. Rabbi Shimon says that it's mutter. Now, again, once again, Abosai, the Gemara is assuming that what's the status of the grisin in this case? The Gemara is making the assumption, hot. And therefore, again, it's no sein tam lifgam. So we'll say once again, this would seem to be a case of no sein tam lifgam, because everyone knows vinegar into hot grisin is going to be no sein tam lifgam, and yet they're still having the machlokes. Right? Meir says aser, Rabbi Shimon says mutter. Well, maybe let's go back before. Ula explained this already. What did Ula say? No, this was a case of where what? The vinegar actually fell into cold grisin, and then it was subsequently heated up. So this was no sein tam l'shvach that then became lifgam. That's how he explained it. But does anybody really argue in that case? Does anybody argue in a case of where ultimately, again, first the mixture was beneficial and then became detrimental, that ultimately, again, it's going to remain aser? V'hakatani, nafal shel truma tchila, divrei hakol aser. So we had this case. Right, where the truma leavening agent fell in, and then the chulin one fell in. Everyone agrees that the loaf is aser. What do you see from there? And I will say this goes back to yesterday's daf. Remember again, I will say one of our takeaways from yesterday's daf. When do you establish the halachic identity of a mixture? Remember a little chazara. When do you establish it? At the moment it's created. So therefore, again, if you have a mixture and it's l'shvach, is beneficial, even if subsequently it becomes lifgam, it becomes detrimental, the mixture is still prohibited, right? So when we see this case over and over and over, so therefore again, and this is the starter case, right? So if the starter, if the leaven of truma falls in, and then afterwards the leaven item of chulin falls in, everyone agrees that mixture is aser, even though again it's why. Because it started the shvach, and that's what we look at the moment the mixture was made. So therefore, everyone will also agree that if you have vinegar that falls onto cold greasing and then was heated up, the mixture is going to be aser because it started out ultimately again aser. Elalash shmamina. Here we go. Bepagam meikara machlokish shmamina. Therefore, we'll say halacha l'maisa. Halacha l'maisa. Gemara says you're right. Therefore, we have conclusively proven now that this is indeed a machlokes, a fundamental machlokes tanaim, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Meir, about no sein tam lifgam. And what are they arguing about? Where the mixture is detrimental from the beginning. Detrimental is probably the wrong word, but you understand what I mean. I don't know what the better opposite of beneficial is in a mixture context, but you understand, right? Ultimately, again, where halacha l'maisa now, the Gemara says, all the Gemara is just proven on both sides is that there indeed is a machlokes tanoim about no sein tam lifgam. When you have a mixture, and from the outset, the mixture has a detrimental taste infusion, there is a fundamental machlokes. Rabbi Meir says that is still aser. Rabbi Shimon says no, that is mutter. What does everyone agree on? Everyone agree on? Let's go right. We have folks what everybody agrees on. No saying tam l'shvach is going to be asr, right? Everyone certainly agrees that when there is a mixture and the prohibited item provides a beneficial taste infusion, that of course that is going to be asr. What else does everybody agree on? That when it's no saying tam l'shvach and then afterwards became lifgam, when it began as a positive taste infusion, right, beneficial, and then becomes detrimental, everyone also agrees that that is asr. So the good news is, out of 2 of the 3 cases, everyone agrees on, right? No sein tam l'shvach, beneficial taste infusion, asr. No sein tam l'shvach, and afterwards became lifgam, everyone agrees is asr. Machlokes case, no sein tam lifgam. When the initial taste infusion was asr, Rabbi Meir was detrimental. Rabbi Meir says asr. Rabbi Shimon says mutter. Good. That's it. Says the Gemara. Now, hani plasi bavi diktani lamali. So we'll say now the Gemara just wonders why the brisa, right? The brisa had a whole bunch of cases that seem to be saying the same thing. Why do I need all of these cases? Hani tlasa bavi diktani lamali. So the Gemara says, here we go. Look at Rashi. Rashi says tlasa bavi, 3 lines down from the top. Reisha hecha denaflu ka'achas ashvina plukta. So remember again, the Reisha was where the leavening agents fell in at the same time. That was case 1, right? So the Gemara says, now we're going to go through all of them. Bishlama bava this. Actually, if you just look at the Rashi, mitziasa nafal shel truma tchila. So again, first case is where both leavening agents fall in at the same time. Middle case is where the truma leavening agent falls in first, and then chulin second. Seifa, the last case in the brisa, was ultimately again the wine falling into the lentils or to the grisen, or vinegar into the grisen, right? Wine into lentils, vinegar into grisen. So Gemara says, "Hani tlase bavi diktani lamali." So bishlam above the seifa. I understand ultimately again when the seifa. Remember again, the seifa is the vinegar onto the grisen. That's necessary. Why kamash malon bepogem meikara machlokes. Ultimately, I need to teach us that no sin tam lefkam ultimately is a machlokes. Mitziasa. Why do I need the middle case? Nami hishpiach lubasof pagam divrei kol aser. So that's to teach us again. I both say that if there's no sin tam l'shvach, and then ultimately again becomes lifgam, as we just mentioned before, everyone agrees aser. Ela reisha lamali. Why do I need the first case? Now again, the first case was when both of them fall in at the same time. Hashta uma seifa delo kamashbach klal asri rabbanon. If in the seifa case, ultimately again where there was no benefit, the rabbanon, who's Rabbi Meir, still say that it's aser. Reisha the kamashbach mibai. That in the reisha where there is an objective benefit, is there anything to say? Amar Abaye, reisha Rabbi Shimon itzderich. The first case the brayso was needed according to Rabbi Shimon. Why? Vachi kamri. This is what I mean. Vachi kamri the rabbanon Rabbi Shimon. This is the rabbanon saying to Rabbi Shimon. Isazu ru'uya lahachmitz b'shtei shas. So we'll also listen to this. So really, what's happening over here is as follows: the reisha. Now remember, the reisha was where the case of both leavening agents, truma and chulin, fall in at the same time. So in this case, interestingly enough, the rabbanon said the following to Rabbi Shimon: Isazu, this dough, ru'uya lahachmitz b'shtei shas, really normally would have taken 2 hours to become chametz. Mi garam la shetachmitz b'sha achas. What caused it to have an accelerated leavening process? In other words, apparently, when you introduce 2 leavening agents into into dough, it doesn't go bad immediately. What ends up happening is it goes bad after time, but something interesting happens, which is there's obviously an accelerated leavening process. So what caused this dough, which would normally leaven in 2 hours, to leaven in 1 hour? Isser. Ultimately, again, it's the prohibition. It's the prohibition. And therefore, again, and then remember, this is the Rabbanon, who's Rabbi Meir, wanted to suggest that therefore there is a benefit. There is a benefit involved over here. And because there is a benefit, therefore, halacha l'maisa should be aser. Rabbi Shimon, kishishbichu shneihem, hishbichu, kishepagmu shneihem, pagmu. Rabbi Shimon says, you're right. Maybe there is some initial benefit, but at the end of the day, the result of the mixture is detriment. And just like ultimately, again, they both participated, so to speak, in some initial benefit, they also both participate in some initial detriment. Rabbi Shimon, according to Rabbi Shimon, let the heter and the isser, right, which again is the leavening agent of chulun and truma, come together and aser. Rabbi Shimon l'tamei da'amar afilu isser ve'isser nami lo mitzdarfi. Rabbi Shimon holds that at the end of the day, isser, 2 different types of isser do not combine. Disnan, ha'arla uklaya kerem mitzdarfin. Rabbi Shimon Omer ein mitzdarfin. Ultimately, again, this is actually an interesting discussion, which we're going to have later on, which is, do different forms of Isser combine to form a shear of Isser? So the Brisa says over here, the Mishnah says over here, that Arla and Klaya Kerem, which are two, remember again, Arla is forbidden fruit, first 3 years of growth. Klaya Kerem is forbidden mixtures, ultimately in a field. So the Tanakama, the Abanan hold, that actually they combine to form a shear. Rabbi Shimon says that Isser does not combine to form a shear. Okay, so we'll say, so again, that's the end of this case. So bottom line over here, right? Let's just be solid on our facts, right? Everyone agrees, no seitam l'shvach, aser, right? Everyone agrees, no seitam l'shvach, v'hadar nifkama, if it begins, right, l'shvach, and then again afterwards becomes l'fkam, everyone agrees is aser. No seitam l'fkam, machlokes. Rabbi Meir ultimately telling us that it is aser. Rabbi Shimon saying that it's mutter. We're not finished this yet. Both said, listen to this case, very interesting. Hahu achbara denafal chavisa de shichra. There was a mouse that fell into a barrel of shechar, of beer. So now what's the status of the beer? Asra Rav lahu shichra. Rav said ultimately again that the barrel of beer is aser. Now Bosai. Now why is this interesting? I would have thought that a mouse in a barrel of beer is what? No, not leave bittul aside right now, right? But it's what? No seitam l'fkam, right? No seitam l'fkam. Remember, the assumption right now, the working assumption is, where's the mouse? Right? Right? It's floating, right? It's or whatever, sinking, whatever. In other words, it's there. So just want to point out over here, you cannot apply the concept of bittul, of nullification, when the Isser is extant, right? Imagine for a moment, right? In other words, you're making a stew, and you saw the recipe says, a piece of chazer would really add the right kind of flavor in here. So you're a shtickle chacham, and when I say shtickle, I really mean like a very small shtickle, right? You're like, this is great. I've got 61 pieces of meat. Let me throw in a piece of chazer over here. It's batal b'shishim. Look at me, right? Batal b'shishim. I outsmarted the system, right? 2,000 years, Jews have wanted to eat chazer. No one figured it out. I figured it out, right? I'm saying, obviously, that doesn't work, right? Why doesn't it work? Because ultimately, again, bittul now could potentially work, right? In other words, if you lose track of the piece of chazer, although if you intentionally put it in there, it doesn't work. I will say, but in general, bittul doesn't work if the isser itself is actually it's sitting there. So therefore, again, what we're worried about over here is, in this case, the assumption is the mouse falls in, and then what do I do? Take it out. I will say, right? Everybody should be in agreement with that. But my mouse falls into your beer, the first thing you're going to do is going to take it out. The shaila now is, was there a taste infusion or not? Was there a taste infusion? And if there was a taste infusion, is that l'shvach or l'fkam? So interestingly enough, in this case over here, asrei Rav lahu shichra, Rav said the beer is aser. Which is fascinating, because what does that say? That Rav says it's no same time l'shvach, like it's beneficial. Like what is that? So the Gemara. So here we go. Amro Rabbanan Kamei Rav Sheshes. So listen to this. So the Rabbanan says before Sheshes. Neima kasavar natal is no sein tam lifkam. That's just an acronym. No natal. Nun tes lamed. No sein tam lifkam is aser. So it must be that Rav holds ultimately again that even a negative taste infusion is going to be aser. It's going to be aser. So therefore, again, that's why the mouse, ultimately, again, we're assuming it infuses taste. We're also assuming that the taste itself is detrimental, but yet it's still aser. Amr Rav Sheshes, ba'alma savarav, no same time lifkam mutter. It's not true. Rav Sheshes says, in general, Rav says, no same time lifkam is mutter. That's generally what he says. So what's going on over here? V'hacha chidushu. We'll say this is fascinating. In general, the Gemara says over here, hacha by sheretz. Remember again, a mouse is a sheretz. By shratzim, there's a chiddush. What's the chiddush by shratzim? The hamimas malis mais ubadili in shimine. They both say this is fascinating. Shratzim are one of those things that even had the Torah not said anything to you, what would have happened? People would have stayed away from it. Right? There was really no reason for the Torah to tell me that you can't eat shratzim, creepy, crawly things. People just like inherently would stay away from it. Va'afilu hachi Asr Rahmana. See, even though, again, inherently, instinctively, I should say, a person stays away from shratzim out of the desire for all the different things in this world. Shratzim generally is not one of them. And yet the Torah still prohibited. So the Torah prohibited something that didn't really need to be asred because man instinctively would have stayed away from it. Therefore, we'll say, what does that tell you? That tells you that it is governed by another set of laws, a more stringent set of laws. And therefore, Hilchach, no sin tam lifkam, nami aser. Fascinating. And therefore, again, because of that, right, because of that, even no sin tam lifkam. So sharetz is going to be an outlier. A sharetz is just unique. Since it didn't really need to be asered, because instinctively I would have stayed away from it anyway. But the fact that the Torah goes out of its way to aser, it says that sheretz is governed by a separate set of rules. So by the rest of items, by the rest of food items, no sein tam lifgam is mutter, at least according to everyone but Rabbi Meir, but here by a sheretz, even no sein tam lifgam, ultimately again is going to be aser. Incredible. Well, if that's the case, that it's a chiddush. If that's the case, then a sheretz should communicate tuma whether it is moist or dried out. In other words, if it's such a chiddush, yet the halacha is alamatnan metamin lach ve'imetamin yivation. Yet Rabbi said the halacha is, interestingly enough, a sheretz only communicates tuma when it's moist. But once it's dried out, it no longer communicates tuma. But if you tell me that sheretz is such a chiddush, then it should communicate tuma in all forms. Well, using that same logic, shichvas zera to tamei lach v'yavish. Ultimately, shichva zera, semen, should also communicate tuma, whether it's moist or dried out. Alamatanan, why do we say metamin lach and metamin yivation? Ultimately, again, only communicates tuma when it's moist, not when it's dry. Elamai islachol meimar. Rather, I will say, what is there to say? Shichvas zera amrachmana beru'uya lahazriya. It only communicates when it's shichvas zera. When is it called shichvas zera? Zera means seed. When it's capable, when it's potent seed. When is it potent seed? When it's moist. Once it's dried up, it's no longer potent. Hachanami b'mosam amirachmana ke'ein mosam. So to over here, I will say by sheretz, the Torah says that a sheretz communicates tuma when b'mosam. Now, what does b'mosam mean? Mosam, the Gemara is actually to mean the way that it is at the time that it dies. What is a sheretz like at the time that it dies? It still is retained its inherent moisture. So only when it's moist does it communicate tuma. Was interesting. Once it's dried up, it no longer communicates tuma. Maskef Ram Semin Arda. So the process is fascinating. So Semin Arda says, 1 second. Umi mais, who says that a mouse is repulsive? V'ha'ola al shulchan melachim. Royalty eats mice. I made a very big mistake last night. I Googled this because I was fascinated by this, about mice as a culinary dish. So it is fascinating to see that in certain countries and historically, for example, even in England, right, rich and poor consumed rat pie. Rat pie, it was consumed, right? In certain African countries and Asian countries, mice are considered to be a form of protein, right? And there's even this guy, this chef on YouTube. Again, don't watch the video. Do not, I'm telling you, do not watch. I made the mistake. It was horrible. But he does prepare culinary dishes made from mice. Absolutely disgusting, right? But fascinating, but absolutely fascinating. So again, I must say, because again, sometimes you see something like, there's no way that's correct, right? It can't be. In any event, so I says, what are you talking about? At the end of the day, so royalty does eat mice. So apparently, both said there are different types of mice. Ultimately, again, there is city mice and desert mice. So Rashi says over here, city mice are disgusting, right? City mice are disgusting. And apparently, again, desert mice, like, range-fed mice, which makes sense. Probably city mice also carry disease or different things like that. But again, kind of free-range mice apparently were consumed. All right, boss, so we're going to stop over here for today. Again, what we still have not resolved, but I just want to point out, What we have not gotten, and I'm dafka stopping because we'll pick up with the rest of this tomorrow, Mir Hashem. We haven't figured out yet what to do with the mouse in the barrel of beer case. Mir Hashem, that'll be tomorrow. And ultimately, again, no say tam lefkam, resolution, Mir Hashem, and halacha lamaisa tomorrow. Bosai, shkoyach. All right, Chabrans, have a great day, everyone. A good chodesh.
It says here the mouse of the desert is a squirrel.
It's a squirrel. Oh, interesting. Ashkarul. Oh, I didn't know. Interesting.
Tastes like chicken. Cuter. Tastes like chicken. Cuter.